Is that you? Is it?
Me?
That's you? Okay.
Yep. I was just waiting for Mr. Henson to come back because he needs to hear this. So yeah, look, just responding to a discussion I had with the chair, reflecting on that there is the document that's in your bundle has been recently released by the government, which includes the much touted swimmability aspects of the National Policy Statement, as well as various refinements of the National Policy Statement. I'll just note in the paper that a more thorough policy analysis will come back to you with a submission, potential submission through the RPC and then to the full council later in April to meet the 28 April deadline. But what I wanted to focus on just was the aspect of the National Policy Statement, which is called the National Objectives Framework, which is the, if you like, the limits part of the policy. These are limits that national limits. They sit around compulsory national values, of which there are two, ecological health and human health. So ecological health, there are a bunch of what we call attributes associated with them, or matters which affect those values that have national limits set around them, including bottom lines. And in the human health for recreation aspect or value, there was a single attribute, and that attribute had for its bottom line a standard that meant a river that was wadeable based on a risk assessment for microbiology had been considered to have met the bottom line for that attribute. That was the thing that resonated with communities through engagement that the Minister for the Environment had in his roadshows. He had one here at Ahuriri where the message he heard from us or from this community was similar to the messages received from other communities, in that they wanted to see a swimmable target, one that was reflected in the National Policy Statement. So he's gone away and done a bunch of work with his ministry officials and others and developed this new policy, to which we were initially reasonably well connected in discussions. And that engagement dried up probably 8 months ago as it's moved into the stage where the Minister's formed some views on what he wanted to do, culminating in release of this document. And the release of the document's been met with some reservation, reservation by some, horror by others, and applause by some. So it's had a mixed reception. And not surprisingly, because actually it's a reasonably complex bit of policy writing, it's probably been a little bit clumsily worded in aspects of it, and it's not clear in many parts of it how the technical parts relate to the policy. And that's all laid out for you in the paper, in the parts where I've sort of talked about what's good and what's uncertain. Just reflecting on what's good before I get into just a quick presentation. What is good now is that previously the narrative in communities, and Hawke's Bay was one of them, was that a river is either swimmable or it's not. So for example, there was a view, and it probably exists for many, that the Tukituki is not swimmable. Well, that's far from the truth. For certain times of the year, at certain flows, the Tukituki, like any other river in Hawke's Bay, they're all kind of similar in the way they behave, will have higher levels of fecal bacteria in it, sufficient to make the risk swimming in that unacceptable. So if you go and swim in it and you accidentally consume water that's high in bugs, you're likely to get infected and you may well get sick. And typically that happens in New Zealand at high flows. So when you have rain that runs material off the land into rivers, that's when you get bugs in rivers. Some rivers naturally carry E. coli in them all year round. But the point being that for the vast majority of the year, when people are actually typically involved in things like swimming, most of New Zealand's rivers, including Hawke's Bay's, are generally safe to swim, i.e. the level of fecal contamination is low. It's never zero, because you've got all sorts of natural sources, including birds, that you can't control. but typically it's low and sufficiently safe to swim in. So what this narrative's moved to is to kind of a view of a river to say, look, and I think it's really helpful, is to say how often are our rivers in that state, i.e. the amount of contaminants in them is low enough it can swim in them, and do we want that to be more often than it is now? And if so, how would we do that? It might be that you assess some of these rivers and say, well, actually, they're safe to swim in reasonably often or very often, and actually you don't want to try and achieve any more than that. And some of them might be a lot lower, and you say, we want to fix those ones. We want to make them safer to swim more often. And it allows us to kind of look at each catchment, figure out its characteristics, and target your efforts to where you want it to go. That said, there is an overall approach the government's taken, and I'll just point out a typo in paragraph 15.4, subsections 1 and 2, where the government said they want 80% of New Zealand's rivers classified as swimmable by 2030, and then they want 90% of them classified swimmable by 2040, that should read. So the government said, we're good, but we want to get better, and that target applies to the country. It doesn't apply to a region, and the Minister's been very clear in the discussions or presentations I've heard from him that he sees this as a national target, and it may well be that areas that are already doing very well might have to do even better to help those regions that are not doing particularly well. That's his view. And he's also clear that within the bands that sit in the attribute table, which I'll show you shortly, he wants to see generally rivers that are in the lower bands, the C's and the B's, being moved up into the B's and the A's. So he wants to see that overall improvement. So it's usefully set a benchmark by which we can measure and assess in a relatively simple way. It's one that's easily understandable, and it gives us now an ability to say, well, how do we want to change that? How could we change it? Where do we want to change it? How do we do that? How long will it take? Sort of thing. So just running through this kind of just repeats what I've said. So it's a risk-based approach. So the approach has changed, given that we already have a range of measures for assessing bathing sites. So our guidance documents that were produced in 2003 by the Ministry for the Environment set out a risk-based approach to assessing both freshwater and marine sites. This has changed that again slightly, and it certainly gives the optics that the goalposts have been moved, and those are the sorts of things that given the ink is still drying on this stuff, that we're exploring with the Ministry and the officials just to see whether that is actually correct or not. Based on what we see at the moment, we don't believe it has, but we want to make sure that that is the case and just test some of our assumptions and understandings, particularly given that like I say, that the way the document's been worded is not particularly helpful and is not easy to interpret. So just some clarification. So this new standard relates to rivers that are greater than what we call a fourth order, and so the way that we classify rivers in a kind of a structural sense is if you have order relates to size, so the higher the order, the bigger the river. So where you have a river that basically where it starts is a first order stream, where you have two first order streams join, it becomes a second order stream. Where you have two second order streams, it becomes a third order stream, and so on. So it just represents the physical size of a river. So the policy is very clear that it applies to fourth order rivers, but it's not clear, and there are some questions about what that means for rivers that are smaller. The logic would dictate, and the science would tell you that you can't ignore those others, because if you do, you won't achieve your outcomes in your bigger systems. But it gives the impression at the moment that those smaller rivers don't actually have any legal standard that sits over them, which we don't believe is the intent, and probably needs some careful wording to better reflect the intent of the policy. And that's the sort of thing that we're going to be going back to the Ministry on, and may well form the basis of a submission that we bring to you. There has been much talk about Table 1. It's almost like Chapter 13 of some other report that sort of disappeared out of the MFE some years ago. Table 1 is a little bit different in as much that it's a table that doesn't sit in the policy, but it sits on the ministry's website that forms some of the compliance assessments for where a river, which band a river sits in. Now, unhelpfully, Table 1 isn't referred to in the policy, so the policy just has a list of numbers, but actually it's very clear in the documentation on the ministry's website that Table 1 is very important. So we're looking to get some clarification on how that works, or even better, why don't we just bring Table 1 into the policy, and what would that look like? Where and when compliance is assessed. Again, I think we're getting a bit of a sense that compliance is assessed everywhere, all of the time, sort of thing. So it's not at a point at which our recognised swimming sites, for example, during the bathing beach season, which is typically how we've done our compliance assessments in the past based on the 2003 guidelines. The view now is that it's the whole system, and it's all year round based on monitoring that we would do all year round. So that creates some challenges for us when we then come to talk about what could we improve and how do we go about doing that, if that's the measure against which we're going to be assessed. Built into the policy also is some reasonably prescriptive monitoring requirements, particularly where their trigger levels are reached, where we move from potentially weekly or monthly sampling, depending on how you run it, into daily sampling for periods of time. And again, we need to understand whether we're doing that at a point in the catchment or the whole catchment, because if it's the whole catchment, then it could be that we have staff out doing daily measurements on multiple sites across many catchments throughout the region for, it could be some weeks at a time. So there's significant resourcing implications for us that we need to work out whether that's the intent, and if it's not, how do we better reflect that in the wording of the policy. So look, the other thing that what's happening at the moment is later this month there's going to be a workshop with ministry officials, the sectors, science, community and policy people, where all of those things are going to be battered around and clarification sought directly from them, sufficient that those good folk can then come back and do further policy analysis and write submissions or draft them for you to consider. The other really important part to this document is that the Minister's made very clear, and he's put it in letters to the Chair of the Council and chairs of all regional councils, is that he expects you to deliver to him by October this year your plans, your targets and your plans for improvement across the region. So a draft by October and then a final version of that by March next year. That's actually a very substantial piece of work for us to do, because what we need to be able to do to help you set those targets in a sensible way is go away and undertake a reasonably chunky piece of modelling to figure out what's possible, where it's possible, how long it will take and how much will it cost, and bring that back to you in some form of advice. It then needs to, if this is a target that Council's committing to, it may well have LGA implications in terms of costs to this community and the need to consult that we would have to think about and advise you on. But most importantly, it's kind of what's the art of the possible here? What can we actually achieve through the toolbox that we've got? How much difference can we make? What sort of improvements can we expect to see in these catchments and over what time frames? So what we're doing is that's a separate piece of work that we're doing collaboratively with the ministry, who have got a bunch of modelling people from CRIs available. We're going to manage and coordinate some scenarios with them so that we can sensibly come back with some options that are reasonably that we could be reasonably confident of achieving, and some reasonable estimates around costs of achieving that, or how we would do it and the costs. So that's a bit of work that's starting Tuesday next week with an initial round of discussions on how we do that. But what I wanted to give you a sense of is that and like I say, I think it's really good now that we have a measure by which we can set about talking to our communities around what they want to do in terms of making improvements. So that's a really positive thing. We've moved away from this notion that a river is swimmable or it's not, to it being something that is good some of the time and not so good other times, and looking to shift those balances around to get it good better or good more often. But one of the things that we know from work that we've done and that the ministry have done and others have done, is that there's some real challenges in actually achieving some of these shifts in microbiological indicators in water for a bunch of reasons I'll talk about shortly. Also, sorry, that was table 1. I'll just skip over that because it's too much detail in there. So we like I say, we're into this sort of modelling space, into the what's in the art of the possible, and how long will it take, and who pays, all of the sort of questions that you're going to want to traverse. So this is the region, so this is the scale based on fourth order rivers, so those are our fourth order rivers coloured blue, so that's the scale at which we're looking. So that's the region overlaid. So it's a reasonable bit of real estate we're talking about. And the view of the minister is that any part of those rivers on a 12-month basis will be, compliance will be assessed against the new National Objectives Framework attribute. So it's a big bit of work for the region, as it is for New Zealand. So in 2016, MPI and MFE did a study of looking at stock exclusion rules and saying, okay, if we bring this tool to the toolbox, what sort of improvements are we likely to see in microbiological indicators in fresh water? And it's a really useful basis for us to start to think about, well, okay, what could we likely achieve in Hawke's Bay? And it's not actually that that's startling a tool for you, so as the work would reveal. So what this shows is the figure up, or the bit up the top here is our current, our baseline. So don't worry about the words in there, but it's basically saying, look, what are we doing now? And down the bottom here it's saying, what if we bring in stock exclusion to pretty much every sort of grazing animal on slopes up to and including 28 degrees, so into our steepest hill country? What sort of improvement would we likely get from this column here, which is your bottom line? How much could we move them out of the bottom line, and how much improvement could we get into the A and B bands, which are your top two bands? And what it shows us is that we can reduce our movement from the bottom line by about 3%, and we can increase our top bands by about 3%. So it's not a massive shift. Okay, so you're not going to move heaven and earth just with stock exclusion alone. And this is reflected also in some work that NIWA scientists did recently, where they looked at MFE's, their National Water Quality Network data and said, well, look, where are we generally sitting with our compliance with these microbiological guidelines based on land use or land cover? And you can see that the two right-hand box plots there, which are your pasture and your urban, are well above the red dotted line, which is your guideline value. But importantly, even your exotic forestry and indigenous forestry will still exceed it. Okay, so you've still got challenges even in your unmodified catchments. And look, and this isn't surprising, because what you're talking about is the bacteria from warm-blooded animals, pigs, deer, goats, all of those things that you aren't actually going to be able to manage through land use change. But the biggie is that you've got about and this shift here from in pasture to get it down is about a factor of 5 reduction. And what that earlier study and this tells us is that in many places, the only real tool that's going to get you down there will be land use change.
What is MAS?
It's the maximum allowable standard. Yeah. So this is the work that we're going to be doing with the ministry, is to say, well, okay, given the tools in the toolbox now, how much shift can we get in this? and what would you need to do beyond that if you wanted to make more substantive changes. And the initial view, and again this is all caveated that we haven't done any of the work, is that the toolbox isn't going to give you a lot, and it may well be a far more aggressive policy agenda around land use control and land use change to achieve these things. And look, there's just a recurring theme of this stuff in the literature, so this is some more stuff that was done recently. This is an update of the earlier information where, again, it shows even in our indigenous and exotic forestry, there's a large number of sites that fail to meet the standards, and in this particular study, all of the urban and pretty much all of the pasture ones did as well. So for us to move some of these, is, there's some difficult choices that are going to have to be made.
And that 3% reduction represented about $2 billion, I think, worth of investment in stock exclusion and fencing to get the 3% reduction in E. coli.
Yeah. Nationally. Yeah.
Nationally.
Yeah.
We haven't done the work.
So this is the work that we would do. Is we're looking to bring back to you. This is what we would do. This is how long it would take. Here's the improvement you'll get, and here's the indicative cost. And then you can grapple with, where you want to set the dials, basically. But all I'm doing is counselling you that that there are some significant challenges here, and your traditional sort of our toolbox may not give us everything we need. Now, I'll caveat that also that this is just a focus on the microbiology. Actually, stock exclusion for a whole lot of other reasons is a very, very good thing, particularly for physical habitat, sediment reduction, shading, temperature. So I'm not casting aside the value of that tool. It's absolutely important for good ecological health management. And if you're talking about the ecological health components, the in-stream values, but it's not going to be a great tool for human health for recreation, it would seem. And we're going to have to think about how we deal with that. And it may well be that communities are faced with an acceptance that, look, for some catchments and some times of the year you can't shift it, short of pulling all the grazing animals off it. That may well be something that they have to face and have that discussion.
And I think in our case, Ian, it'd be fair to say that we're sitting at 76% at the moment in terms of with the targets. So to get to 80% by 2030 may be achievable with comprehensive stock exclusion and everything that we throw at it. But to get to 90% in this region, you literally will be talking about removing stock from the land in large scale. So taking them out if you want to get to that level. So central government's known about the scale of the problems with this and the challenges, and ministers have had advice for years on this, but they've lost the public relations war and they've lost the agenda. So now you're seeing central government throwing it back to us in some respects to deal with this. So there's a massive challenge with trying to get the public to understand what we're talking about here. And when we bring these costs and the scale of change back to the community, we'll see some reality come into this conversation.
So the view changes depending on how you want to assess compliance. Like I say, this is kind of the year-round view. If we could get a conversation along the lines of, well, look, actually people typically swim in Hawke's Bay during October to March in a typical year, and that's the area or time of the year we really want to focus on, all of this work will look quite different. It's going to depend on, your temporal element, what time of the year you want to deal with, as well as your scale. Where are you going to assess it? If you're assessing it down on the coast or in your known swimming spots, that'll be a different picture than if you're having to assess it all year round in all locations. The latter being far more challenging than the former. And again, it comes down to a value discussion with the community, because I fully understand that certainly for tangata whenua, they won't accept or don't accept that it's only during the summer. It should be all year round. And for some recreational users of water, the crazy ones that kayak down rivers and floods, well, they want it clean as well. So how do you deal with that? How do you reconcile all of those things? But like I say, I'm just saying to you that it's not going to be an easy journey. It's great that we've started it and we've got a kind of a framework by which we can start having a sensible conversation, but there's not going to be any magic solution or silver bullet here that sees us with a quick fix. Yeah. So that's all I've got, and I'm happy to take any questions. Don't want to be the,
Thank you, Chair.
that's enough.
I'm a bit depressed after hearing that. I thought it was. I actually had a solution for the fencing. Gallagher's not far away from having an ear tag for cattle beasts, cattle only really, that you can program with a GPS coordinate. So if they get within a certain distance of the water, on the way there they get a beep. They get closer, they get 2 beeps. If they go over the line, they get an electric shock. And if they poop in the water, they get vaporised. So, so it's it's sort of covers everything. But the question I have, I lost my train of thought now. The question I have is, if we had the 6 months window you talked about, where would we be? Would it be 90%?
Look, I can't tell you off the top of my head, but it will be. Look, we're at 78% odd now.
Year round.
Year round, it'll be a hell of a lot better. Typically, our sites, in the standard guideline-based monitoring that we do, are safe for swimming during our swimming periods. We've got some hot spots, like I think like Pataki Lagoon. We've had an area where we've had geese crapping in the water. Mahanga, places like that, periodically because of septic tanks have been a problem. But typically most of our known recreational sites during our summer months are very, very good and may well meet the 90%. I haven't looked at that, and I don't know that we've actually assessed that as an overall target.
So the challenge, the way I see it, Chair, through you, is we need to be very clear in our messaging to tangata whenua, to everyone, that, hey, this is where we are now, and that's, what it might cost to keep us there. But if we want to do this other thing, these are the costs, because there's some huge hurdles even to get there, and certainly around our urban outfalls.
And Graham's all depressed because this is the first science presentation he heard and it wasn't a good one. But look, just to be absolutely clear though, that the stock exclusion and all that sort of stuff absolutely has significant ecological health benefits. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that keeping stock out of water bodies is absolutely what we want to do. The challenge is that it's not going to help us a lot for keeping the crap off the land from getting in the water, because that gets picked up and carried by water, and no riparian strip, unless it's massive, is likely to do much good for that.
Thanks, Chair. I've got 2 questions. The first is on page 37 of the report, where you've got a list of attributes for ecosystem health. That's the current list. There's no MCI there. Has MCI been added? I never saw it in the paper.
It's a bone of contention. So I'm part of the reference group that's helped frame up the National Objectives Framework, and it's been something that from day one we've talked about. And the reference group has been very keen to see MCI added as an attribute. The difficulty is that an MCI is an overall indice of ecological health that's not, and is affected by all of the things, or many of the things you see in the table. So it doesn't lend itself well to being an attribute in the legal sense, which is a problem. So the short answer is it is that LAWF and others want to see it in there as an attribute, but the Minister and the Ministry have said no. But what they've agreed to is to have it as a look at it as a compulsory monitoring tool, to say have it in there as a measure of ecological health, and if it gets to a certain level, you should be in there finding out why and addressing it in policy, because you've got a problem with the health of your system. That's the kind of compromise position.
Okay. And my second question relates to the table on page 235 of the attachments, which deals with human health for recreation. And you've got those various categories, blue, green, etc. If we just take for one of them, green, the right-hand side narrative attributes state the river or lake is good to swim in most of the time. The estimated risk of Campylobacter infection is likely higher than 50 cases in every 1,000 exposures. Now that sounds to me like there's 1 chance in 20 if you go swimming you're going to get infected, and I can't believe that would be a sensible standard. So can you explain to me what the 1,000 exposures means?
So again, this is the disconnect in the table one that I brought back up is because if you take,
Oh, you better turn
that's right. If you take the table one figures, the risk that's described in the narrative attribute state is theoretically a lot less. And there's a disconnect between what's written in the narrative state objective and what table one, which is the basis for the numeric, tells us. And so we're trying to figure out, well, actually, we don't believe that's, a 50 and 1,000 or a 5% risk is kind of acceptable for communities. And that doesn't compute with it being in an A category. And it's different to the risk that is presented by table one. So how does that work, and what was the intent? Because if the intent is that A should be low risk, then how you put it together or how it's been put together isn't giving that indication.
But that percentage is based on a year round, which
Yes.
is to say over the whole year, that's the percentage chance of getting. So if you swam every single day, 5 to 10% of the time in a band B, you would get unwell. And this is the methodological problem, because the existing standards and guidelines were all predicated on managing risk around when people actually swim. And when you try and take this out over the whole year, you then bring in all your high rainfall events, you bring in winter, and therefore actually that percentage probably isn't too bad, because it actually means that given in any given catchment you're probably in reasonable rainfall 5 to 10% of the time, that's when you're failing to meet the standards. So this is where it's got really, really difficult for the scientists and for the policymakers to how do you turn something that is focused on managing risk around popular swimming times to a year round, and what's a meaningful measure of risk across a whole year.
Well, you can't help thinking this has been cobbled together and without a lot of forethought, because this is such an obvious question to be asking. I can't believe that you can't rationally give us an answer based on the
Well, and again,
report.
simply because we didn't write the policy, and until we talk to the ministry to find out, well, what do you mean here, we can't. I mean, we could speculate on a whole lot of what ifs, but I'd rather not do that. And look, the point you makes a good one, and this has been the issue that's kind of driven the notion that the minister's shifted the goalpost. Because if you look at the new measure there of 540 CFUs per 100 mils, that's quite different to the 2003 guidelines. But this is based on 130 if you were going to meet the A. But
meet the A band.
Meet the A band. But 130 is in the table here. And what they're saying is that if you meet these tests, any of these tests are relative. So if you meet one test, one of these tests, depending on how you look at it, you'll meet the others. So this is the disconnect in the narrative in the community. They're saying that actually you've just screwed the numbers to make it look good, when that may not actually be the case. And so we're trying to get to the bottom of that.
So is the bottom line here that as a council we should be publicly agnostic as to whether we, given that we're in a national political year here, and while we're waiting for all this clarification to occur, meanwhile we're being buffeted by all sorts of claims about whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, is it even possible for us as a council to have a simple, here are 12 basic questions about this, here's the answer, or in some cases the answer is to be determined, or, I mean, it sounds like we're saying we're basically kicking the touch at the moment as to whether we think this is a workable approach, one that we can be enthusiastic about.
Yeah, so you'll have a much bit clearer view when we bring back to you our guidance on the submission. It's just that it's still very fresh and we haven't had the chance to sit down and do the work with them to figure it out. I mean, if I was to give you any advice, it would be that I think it's really valuable and helpful now that the focus of the community is on the swimming standard, and that we've moved from this binary on or off, it's swimmable or it's not, to a how do we assess it over a year round and how do we make it better, rather than saying a river, because like I say, the narrative in the community in many places, a river's not swimmable. Well, that's just not the case.
Thank you, Chair. Some of us are not unhappy with the debacle that happened, the announcement from central government, so that's all good. But my question rolls around point 16, where you obviously have to do the draft target for government by October this year. Do you need any guidance from us? My question is, do you think you need any guidance from us as to what we feel should be our targets for our water bodies?
Absolutely will, and so later in the year, once we've got this program of work up and running that I described, we'll be coming back to you to say what sort of scenarios do you want to test here. And ideally, what we may well be able to do is do kind of a rough and ready. We may have done kind of a range of them to put to you and say, well, here's what it looks like from one end to the other. Where do you want to sit in that? Do you want to run some other scenarios? So absolutely, we'll want to get your guidance on where you want to sit in all of that. Definitely.
Can I just add that this isn't programmed into, because it's obviously fallen from the sky, so it's not programmed into annual plan, and what we're proposing to do is reprioritise internal resource to essentially deal with this issue, and we will have to pick up the implementation of this in the long-term plan conversation. We do have the slight benefit, at least with the tank catchments, of swimmability being a key value that's coming through there, and quite a lot of science work going on to understand what we can deliver in terms of E. coli reductions in the tank catchments. So we'll leverage that work into this process to minimise the sort of additional work, but obviously the rest of the region comes into this as well. So it's a chunky piece of work, and it's for science and it's for policy and planning as well.
Well, that just touched on my question really, and I guess I'm being overly simplistic, but can our answer not be that we're doing the plan changes throughout the regions and just include it?
Well, I think this is one thing that hasn't been well understood, and all the noise around this is that we are still required to identify the values for the community as part of the MPS and reflect those into the plan changes. And where a community says that they want to swim somewhere, that will be part of all of our catchment-wide plan changes. So none of that changes, if you like.
So one of the, I don't think we're going to get a shift from the government to say, no, that's fine, you're doing it in your regional policy, we don't need targets. What they may well do is give us a little bit of flex in terms of the time to line up with our consultative processes for the LTP, to go and talk to communities about what we need to do in terms of the costs and the timeframes.
Just with a tangata whenua's point of view, I think us as tangata whenua have to have a good conversation with what standards are coming out. And why I say that is having a collective conversation around, now tangata whenua are good-sized landlords, this is the kind of implication and this is what kind of money is going to cost to keep it clean. And that means, swimmable is what it is, and, some of them say drinkable. But with some of the size of the operations with forestries, farming practices, and big farms they're buying, there's going to be some cost factors involved of the operations. But I think it's a good conversation to have together now and a reality check to tell them we have to all pull our socks up regarding big operations, regardless what it is.
We're getting dangerously close here to raining on Mr. 80's parade. And we have a couple more agenda items here. I think where we are here is that we know we're going to get within about 2 weeks a draft submission, which will be flagging the issues that we think need to be raised about this, the clarifications that we want to seek and so forth. And I'm not sure that there's much more we can learn out of this process at the moment. Can we proceed?
Can I just be indulged for a moment?
Yes.
Chair, sorry about that, because it may be relevant to the next steps. Great paper, pity it's so late in the day because it probably needed a day on its own. But I've asked this question. The choice of measure is swimmability, and there's somewhat of a PR exercise around that. You've heard from us as a council that we're looking for a degree of excellence in what we do as opposed to, the single measure. We could do one of two things. We could proceed and meet the government requirement by simply choosing an off-the-shelf measure, or alternatively, as you're suggesting, we go through a whole major body of work to get there, and given the importance of it, we're going down that road. But can I ask this other question, is should we expand it to include a broader measure in terms of the ecology of the habitat we've got in our rivers and waterways? So that's another set of measurables, and in addition to that, consider the, if you like, the cultural element as to, you know, the capacity of the river to provide a food source as being yet another, if you like, measurable on that journey to clean it up. So it's got multiple drivers in terms of the strategies that fall out of it. So I'm really asking that question: is there scope within is this the right hat to drop onto? Is this the framework we can swing a lot of other things onto in order to create this excellence that we espouse to?
I think the short answer is yes. So effectively, the government's always been very clear that the National Objective Framework approach is a minimum, if you like. It's saying this is the basic we would expect, and there are a whole lot of other attributes that you could choose as a community to add in there. So it's got compulsory ones you must have and must reflect in policy. You can add others in if you saw fit. And I would say absolutely having an indice or a metric for ecological health would be hugely important, and that's what MCI is supposed to be, and we're doing now far more MCI monitoring throughout our network than we have in the past to try and start building a picture on that. We're also working collaboratively across the sector to look at whether we can combine an indice that brings in not only bugs but fish and physical habitat, so we can build an even more comprehensive view of whether it's good, bad, or it's getting worse or it's getting better. So there is always, and absolutely should be, the possibility of saying, well, you've got your baseline and your basic requirements, but do you want to and can you add more? And the answer is absolutely you can. And so it's always been part of the sort of narrative as part of the National Objectives Framework to say don't see the bottom lines as your target. Actually, the A band is your target, and if you want to add more in, absolutely you should be, because there's a whole section in here around te mano te wai and te mano te tangata. So health of the people and health of the water. Mahinga kai is an important part of that. And if we want to bring in some reflection of that, absolutely, it's at your disposal to do that. The only challenge we have technically is how do we monitor mahinga kai, and how do we do Mātauranga Māori monitoring effectively? And it's something that nationally nobody's kind of cracked the nut on yet. There's a whole lot of models and approaches, but there's no perfect tool. And of course, it's all resource. It all hinges on resources as well and how much you want to throw at it.
Can I just add briefly that the National Environmental the stock exclusion regulations, which are proposed as part of this package to apply nationally, will have to be reflected in the fullness of time in our regional resource management plan. There are a whole bunch of co-benefits, as Ian has outlined, of that. We will have to do a Section 32 analysis around the costs and benefits of. While there's no discretion about putting it in, we will need to assess in consulting the community on it through the process, the implications, and I guess the benefits, the broader benefits, are something that we're going to have to estimate as part of that process.
Someone care to move that we receive the report?
Happy to move.
Seconder? Mr. Curtin, care to speak?
No, Mr. Chair, other than I wonder whether in the next iteration, it was 2 or 3 weeks' time, that perhaps those options could be included as well, indications of those other measures.
So just to be clear, what we're bringing back to that'll be the Regional Planning Committee on the 4th of April, will be our submission on the discussion document. So it'll be in response to at a very high level, the policy as proposed. And the more detailed and specific issues that you've raised will be further down the track. Yep.
Okay. Any other comments? All those in favor of the motion? Opposed? Okay. On to our last item.
Yeah, can I just ask Rena to join us, Rena Douglas, Senior Planner who's been looking after the energy strategy work.
Namahi koutou. I'll keep this pretty quick, just to provide you all with an update on the work that Council's been doing in regards to electric vehicles. Some of you may have seen Minister Bridges and co being very vocal and active in the media at the moment, promoting electric vehicle uptake more and more so in the region, in the country. So on that basis, Council has been working with interested stakeholders such as businesses, NGOs, tangata whenua groups and others, looking at ways of increasing uptake in Hawke's Bay. If you look at some of the publicly available statistics on electric vehicle usage in the country, Hawke's Bay features quite low in terms of uptake. So there's definitely some challenges and some options there for improving that uptake. So just to go back probably about a year, one of the big issues that was identified as part of long-term plan consultation was generating an energy strategy for the region, and there were a number of workshops that were held prior to me starting here. I picked up the energy strategy area, and one of the, I guess, low-hanging fruit that was identified as part of that is, can we look at getting better uptake of electric vehicles in Hawke's Bay? So on that basis, we had a workshop last year, and as part of that workshop, we sort of really tried to strip back some of the myths around electric vehicle usage, and I guess get people in the room talking and making connections and promoting some of the benefits. We've since heard from that workshop that a lot of people have been making their own connections privately and have been going away and driving these vehicles, looking at furthering commercial arrangements on their own. So that's been really positive. The other thing to mention is that Unison are really keen on promoting electric vehicle usage in Hawke's Bay. They're doing a lot of work about getting charging stations up and running. You've probably seen some of their stuff in the media. They're also, they've also opened up charging stations in Taupo and Rotorua as well. So they're really looking at unlocking the central North Island and giving people more options in that sense. So we've been looking at, supporting them, and they have been successful recently in applying for some government funding, and that will see the introduction of a charging station on the Napier-Taupo Road, which will hopefully mean that that's going to unlock the region up for those people travelling over from the central North Island. So they're really interested, and we've just been working alongside them, helping them and, trying to assist them. So really what we see our role as going forward, I guess, is that we can really enable a lot of those discussions and connect a lot of the groups up. There is, potential for, we've discussed a web portal, or we're calling it a virtual electric vehicle showroom, which we could attach to the Regional Council website, for example, and that would be a one-stop shop for key information for people, ranging from consumers who are interested through to local businesses. Hey, these are the models, this is what you'd potentially be paying, and again, demystifying some of the myths about electric vehicles. So that's a real tangible way that we can help. In terms of our direct sort of influence, we are limited, as I've sort of outlined in the paper, but we can have that influencer role and connect people and enable some of those discussions. We also have a role to lead in terms of our example. So Regional Council has 2 hybrid vehicles, so that's a mix of electric and petrol vehicles, and we're looking at more, I guess, expanding the fleet in that sense as well. And we will also, I think, convene another workshop very soon, which will update those participants that attended last year and see what's happened in that time and ways we can continue to assist. So that's kind of a really high-level overview. Here are pātai whakaaro, questions, thoughts. Happy to take any questions.
Alan?
Thank you, Rena, for that. Yes, over the last 3.5 years, we are going into that space of sustainable electric cars. As Tūhoi already talking with Tesla, the guy overseas, been in collective conversations with that guy around how we could use Te Uruwera route as a sustainable route and using electric vehicles in a sensitive environment. So they're in that conversation, and especially around solar panel usage. They've emulated that on their living building challenges, and hopefully, especially like Wairoa down that way, we have a lot of sun, just like here in Hawke's Bay, and it's how we move in that sustainable future, collaborating sun rays into motor vehicles that are very positive. And I have had a drive of one of those cars. I'm telling you, it's there. You can't hardly hear them. It's a hard case. But for farmers, for example, the field days is a great place where regional councils should take that exposure around two-wheeler motorbikes that are electric, and they're very fuel efficient, or pretty much run on electricity. But that's good buy-in for farmers if they want to move into the future on that. So kia ora.
Just a brief comment again, something I keep on bringing up and reiterating is as the council looks at replacing their fleet, especially the ones that don't have to go off-road and so on. We need to be leader. We need to be one of the leaders in the community on this particular issue about electric vehicles or even hybrid vehicles.
Yeah, so just to add to that, the fleet and facilities manager here, she's really interested in electric vehicles and has been doing a lot of research, so I think she's quite keen to advance.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure to see the chair driving around in a electric vehicle.
Yep.
I was just going to make a comment of that. I had dinner with a mate of mine last night, and he's buying the top of the range Tesla, and I think would make a very good chair's car, 220 grand.
Yep.
Other questions, comments? I would just comment that the stakeholder group that was been referred to is pretty broadly based. It includes all the councils, DHB,
Yep.
a variety of private sector players, Unison, car dealers, et cetera. I look at this as sort of a low-hanging fruit opportunity. There's a lot. There is a national aspirational objective. We should be playing a part in that, and we can play our part largely by being a convener and instigator of some further activities and some role modeling, basically. We got a very comprehensive presentation from someone as to what's happening in the Wellington, is it regional council, I guess
Yes.
it is.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of things that can be done that don't involve expenditure, but do involve some of our time to play that kind of coordinating roles, so or convening roles. So all we're really saying here today, I think, is that we want to continue to do that and see where it leads us.